Zambia Theater Project presents Homeless Network News, starring Caroline Manheimer, Corey Walton, Ray Tramazak, Marvin Howard, Annette Bryant, Robert Blood, Sol Sepulveda, Tahiti Robinson. Ho, 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 a hearty welcome to America, and to our viewers, welcome to Homeless Network News. I'm your host, Corey Walton, coming to you live from Zambia's world headquarters in downtown Minneapolis. And the title of this week's episode is Rise Up. Our theme, the year in review, activism. And our sponsor for this week's episode is Jewish Voice for Peace, Twin Cities. Jewish Voice for Peace is inspired by Jewish tradition to work together for peace, show social justice, equality, human rights, respect for international law, and a foreign U.S. policy based on these ideas. To find out more about this organization, please visit their website at jewishvoiceforpeace.org. Now, usually we kick off our every episode with our On This Day in History segment. But for this episode, we're going to tweak that a bit and change it to In This Week in History. Now, as all of you know, Tuesday of this week marked the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. And a lot has happened since May 25th, 2020. From the worldwide protest in the aftermath of the killing, to a toxic election season, to the January 6th insurrection and its attack on our democracy. And of course, the trial and conviction of Mr. Floyd's murderer, Derek Chauvin. The country has been through a lot, but a lot of it was necessary. But Darnella Frazier, 17-year-old bystander who filmed the murder of Mr. Floyd with her camera phone, exposed more than just a murder on that day. In many ways, she pulled the curtain back on evil truths that a city, a nation, and a world continually tried to paint as blips of misconduct on the societal radar screen of those in a position of authority, power, and influence. By its duration and its angle, capturing not just the chilling desperation on the face of a man slowly losing his life, but the cold, stoic expression of his murderer, Miss Frazier's Film of the Year served as a springboard for what has truly become and turned out to be a year of activism. Activism. With a camera, a conscience, and some guts, Darnella Frazier unlocked a global movement. Because this week in history, in 2020, finally, there was a visual record of injustice narrated by the voices of horrified bystanders that could not be ignored like all the others. This week in history, 2020. Now on with the show. Consistent with our theme, we have a special year in review segment for you. Now, this piece shines a spotlight on critical topics like the Floyd protest, our nation's political division, and the high-profile trial of Derek Chauvin. But Zambia is indeed an organization of hope, so of course this piece offers some of that as well. Narrated by Marcia Barnes, here is our year in review.
A year after George Floyd, May 25th, 2021, marked the first year since the killing of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer, Derek Michael Chauvin. Between May 25th and June of 2020, many took to the streets in protest upon viewing the video of then police officer Chauvin placing his knee on the neck of Mr. Floyd as he lay on the street. While African Americans marched in protest of what seems to be a pattern of police brutality, they were joined by many throughout the nation. The story of African Americans being killed and brutalized by police officers was not something new to this nation. African American men and women have become victims of some police officers running rogue and not being held accountable. Alas, There was something different about the death of Mr. Floyd that would set this country on a path for change. Come, take a brief journey with me as I highlight the years since the death of Mr. George Floyd. May 25th, 2020. George Floyd was placed in police custody after it was reported that he had attempted to use a fake $20 bill at a cup food store on the corner of 38th and Chicago Avenue in South Minneapolis. Mr. Floyd was cuffed and lay on the ground as he repeatedly reported to then officer Derek Chauvin, "I can't breathe," as the officer held him down by placing his knee on the neck of Mr. Floyd for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. May 26, 2020. Protest in Minneapolis and St. Paul erupts. There were days of rioting and looting as we witnessed the outcry for justice. People throughout the nation joined in the marching and protesting. May 28, 2020, Governor Walz of Minnesota activates the National Guard to assist with quelling the uprising. During the summer following the death of Mr. Floyd, it was clear that something different had occurred. The summer of 2020 witnessed a high and committed level of social activism, both online and offline. June 8, 2020, the Democratic House of Representatives introduces a police reform bill. September 20th, 2020. This ignites 140 protests across the nation. People were sick and tired of brutal police force throughout the nation. It was a reckoning in the making. Black Lives Matter propelled its messaging to the forefront. October 14, 2020, the nation celebrates the birthday of George Floyd as social activism continued. January 29, 2021, Black Lives Matter is nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by Norwegian lawmaker Petter Eide for carrying forward a movement for racial justice. March 8, 2021, former police officer Derek Chauvin is charged with second-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter in the death of George Floyd. March 11, 2021, Chauvin is charged with third-degree murder. March 12, 2021, the family of George Floyd receives a $27 million settlement from the city of Minneapolis. There was an attempt to use the disclosing settlement as a tool to perhaps alter the course of the trial of Derek Chauvin, but justice prevailed. March 29, 2021, the trial of former police officer Derek Chauvin begins. The trial was open via app for people to follow. Thousands watched as witnesses gave emotional testimonies of what they witnessed that day on May 28, 2020. A compelling case was presented by the prosecutors. April 20th, 2021, jury finds former police officer Derek Michael Chauvin guilty on all 3 counts. It took 11 hours for the jury to deliberate their verdict. Thousands of people took to the streets in jubilee over the conviction. Unprecedented. In Minneapolis, joyful protesters and supporters marched from downtown Minneapolis to the George Floyd Square on that fateful corner of 38th and Chicago. June 2nd, 2021, all 4 officers are charged with violating the civil rights of George Floyd. No doubt the year between the murder of George Floyd has been a time of social angst and the outcry from Black and brown communities to take your knee off my neck. Stop killing us. It's not enough that people worldwide have endured the COVID-19 virus, voter suppression, raiding of our nation's Capitol building, and division in our government from people we placed in office. Whew. Through it all, the past year since the death of George Floyd has called our nation to reckon with the growing divide. There is a constant demand for for fair treatment of all of our nation's citizens. Reforms must begin at the city and state levels if we are to turn the tide for racial justice. We now know, if we are watching and if we care, that laws will not change the hearts of men. Rather, it will take an individual desire to be inclusive and fair when it comes to what we proudly claim as democracy. I will end with a part of a Langston Hughes poem, I Too Am America.
Ascend.
Stand up.
Defy.
Disobey.
Rise and shine.
Awaken.
Resist.
Climb.
Agitate.
Stand up.
House. Mutiny.
Awaken.
Rise and shine.
Lift.
Blow sky high.
Awaken.
Rebel.
Now, how was that for a double dose of reflection? The year in review and our Zamly members sharing creative alternative words for rise up. Do you have some idea or synonyms for rise up or thoughts about the year in review? Drop those in the chat box. We'd love to hear from you. Now, as a follow-up to that year in review segment, next up is a new segment that we introduced this season for the first time. Here to give us a sense of what the climate is out there in the street is our very own Annette Bryant with the Weather Report.
Well, speaking of the last year, let's take a look at the weather. What is the forecast today? Are emotions high, low, or in disarray? Well, I need a coat, a sweater, a jacket, umbrella. Anyway, today there is fog and I can't see anything. I look on the map and see no directions. Is that the raindrops I feel? Come out to play, all suited up. Sing and dance and drink some from a cup. Not really. Today there's sun. You hear all kinds of laughter and people having fun. Wind? Yes, wind blowing you this way and that. You may need a jacket and a hat, as a matter of fact. What's happening now? Is that a house I see twirling in the sky? Run for cover. Oh me, oh my. I'm glad that's over. Today's forecast is full of golf-sized hail. Keep your cars in the garage and run fast to your destinations. Today is partly sun with a chance of snow. Whew. Not today in this lovely month of May. Here comes the sun. Let's get out and walk and run and swim and drive. For the lakes and beaches have been waiting for you to arrive. Beyond the Twin Cities Weathery Report, take the time for self-care and embracing each moment.
Taking the time for self-care and embracing each moment. That's some good advice, y'all. Good advice indeed. Fantastic segment by Annette Bryant with the Weather Report. Any thoughts on that piece whatsoever? Please be sure to drop those in our chat box. In the meantime, we're going to keep this train moving with a special interview segment. Now, a major component of our theme this week is activism. And this piece features a guy who decided to convert his resourcefulness into activism. Ladies and gentlemen, meet Zamia friend, Mr. David Jordahl.
Hi, I'm Greg with Homeless News Network. Today's episode deals with activism in the community. Our guest today is David Jordahl, originator and web developer of CSR Direct Project. He'll tell us about how and why he started the project. Hello, David. Welcome to HNN.
Hello, everyone. To me, homelessness is a symptom of a sick and unhealthy and dysfunctional society. Really, that comes down to two main things: me and my story, and how I found myself in the shelter system, and then the project that has developed. I come from a background of domestic abuse and an alcoholic family system that I never got into, never followed in my footsteps of my father and his father. When I first found myself on the street in the shelter system, one of the first things I had to do psychologically and emotionally was to remind myself I was the same person. And here and in my personal website, davidjordal.info, the purpose of that is for me to tell the public and tell my story and to break it down however I need to. And then the project is about continuing to develop something that started as a seed by simply creating a Google Calendar for all the free community meals in Minneapolis or Western Metro. And initially it was just creating a Google Calendar for myself. And this is also an example of leading by example, by developing this because I simply was doing something to take care of myself. We all know that each one of us, when any given person that does something genuinely helpful for oneself, everybody else around us benefits. So essentially CSR refers to community services and resources. But I want to coin the phrase community social responsibility, that you and I have a community responsibility. And that's effectively what this project is about. CSR Minneapolis, csrmpls.info /free meals, free-meals. And you'll find that that's the example listing for what this project has developed into. Again, there's so many stories along the way of what I've encountered, my successes, my personal influence on the homeless population, my connections with and subsequent disconnections with people in authority, responsibility, leadership. Because after creating resource lists, this project is about asking questions about what are we doing, and is it effective? So that's the basic premise behind all of these questions about what are the resources for those most in need? What are the resources for the rest of the community? This work is about the entire community. I hope this has been helpful, and I welcome your questions. You go into one of the websites, you can click on the little balloon at the bottom right and send me a message.
Thank you, Zamley member Greg Tzak Traumazak, for that interview. And thank you so much, David, with all that wonderful information and for showing us activism can come in so many different forms in different ways. Very unique form of activism that David's got going there. Do you have an example of activism? Yours? Someone you know? Let us know in the chat box. We want to hear about it. And while you do that, we're going to press on with a special treat indeed. This is a visual poem from my friend and troopmate Sol Suplavita and her message to the powers to be, because everybody deserves a home.
Greetings, I'm Sol, and I wrote this poem inspired by Jesus, who was homeless, and all the many Jesuses out there that are currently homeless. I titled this poem, Everyone Deserves a Place to Call Home, dedicated to those in charge only to open their minds along with their hearts. I'm gonna be a bit tough and harsh, not to be cruel, but only because I know I should. Here goes, so brace your souls. Warning, in the process of this, your ship might sink. Hey, you, sitting on your throne, don't you know everyone deserves a place to call home? Or do you think it's just you, the high and almighty? You can't be blind to what others see. People homeless in the midst of pandemics, and you don't seem to want to do the right thing to right the wrong going on for too long. You're not doing the job you're paid to do. What's going on? Why not correct what's affecting all, not just a few? Correct yourself, because you know you're wrong. Because while sitting on your throne in that place you call home, you're ignoring ignoring everyone else also deserves a place to call home. Homes are not just for some, they are for all. By now, everyone knows that in this country, everything is now made publicly. So you see, you cannot run and you cannot hide from humanity catching up with your lies. We the people built this great country into what today it is. So you must revise your laws to fit those who, in their pursuit of happiness, must also have a place to live. You can't ignore by turning your face, pretending not to see. Your big fat checks should remind you of your responsibilities, big and small, 'cause it's not all checks and balances based or winning the race or going into each other's face during debates. It's about respect for self and the human race. It's not about some, it's about all within the all, 'cause everyone knows that no one says, I wanna be homeless when I grow up. How would you not know that everyone deserves a place to call home?
Yes, everyone deserves a place to call home. Fabulous work. Thank you so much, Soul. Any thoughts about Soul's visual poem? Share those in the chat box, please. In our humble opinion here at Zamia, not enough activism is being done in this country on homelessness, or indeed the world. And that's exactly why we do what we do. And we continue our efforts to keep such an important issue at the forefront. And speaking of forefront, let's talk about news now. Dun, 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 dun. Uh-oh. What is that sound? Dun, 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 dun. You guessed it. It's headline news. This week's installment includes news on both the local and global fronts. Here with insights on local evictions and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, none other than Marvelous Marvin Howard and Esther O with dun, 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 headline news.
Once again, for the same old news, the dreadful old news.
How are you doing, Marvin?
Hey, I'm doing great. In fact, I'm the bomb.
All right. Glad you're feeling well. Here's some old, but not dreadful, actually inspiring old news that happened in the neighborhood in this past year when some tenants decided to rise up. Our neighborhood made the New York Times.
The tenants who evicted the landlord.
Tenants mobilized for better conditions, resisted evictions, and participated in a rent strike. They banded together and pushed the city council to revoke their landlord's rental license.
The license was eventually revoked, stripping the ability to collect rent. However, the person formerly known as the landlord still owns the apartments. Now he wanted everybody out so he could renovate the building to sell to the highest bidder.
The tenants had another idea. They wanted the building to be sold to them. The tenants reimagined and then reinvented what stable, affordable housing could look like in their community.
And they now collectively own the property. Boom.
That's a good rise up story coming out of last year. Well, speaking of attempted evictions, you may ask, what is going on with the eviction moratorium that went into effect in March of 2020 as part of the declared peacetime emergency in Minnesota? Well, its ending is pending.
Debate over eviction moratorium continues as Minnesota legislative sessions near close.
Despite relaxing a wide range of COVID-19 restrictions, Governor Walz has decided to continue the eviction moratorium. The decision comes as lawmakers grapple with how to transition away from the executive order.
Organizations that work with renters say that moratorium has been critically important.
End to eviction ban must not lead to eviction bomb.
You dropped the bomb on me, baby.
As leaders begin to consider an off-ramp for the moratorium, they must recognize that the COVID vaccine is not going to cure our housing crisis.
The end of the widespread of COVID will not remedy the economic catastrophe happening particularly in communities of color.
Policymakers face an urgent and critical choice. Step back the eviction moratorium with intentionality and sustain the housing stability of renters statewide, or fling open the doors to mass displacement that will impact thousands of households for years to come.
In another part of the world that we are connected to, more than meets the eye, there has also been a story seemingly about evictions, definitely about mass displacement. Palestinians fear loss of family homes as eviction looms.
A legal battle of nearly 40 years has culminated with eviction orders against 36 families in Sheikh Jarrah and 2 other East Jerusalem neighborhoods.
It is estimated that more than 1,000 Palestinians are at risk of being evicted.
The latest Israel-Palestine crisis isn't a real estate dispute.
It's ethnic cleansing. Some strong words. Let's read it again.
The latest Israel-Palestine crisis isn't a real estate dispute.
It's ethnic cleansing.
The ruthless killing of populace. From the Israeli Foreign Affairs Ministry. Regrettably, the PA, that's the Palestinian Authority, and Palestinian terror groups are presenting a real estate dispute between private parties as a nationalistic cause in order to incite violence in Jerusalem, calling the catalyst of an all-out inhumane, I don't even have the words for it, attack on Gaza a real estate dispute is a particularly noxious way to diminish what is actually occurring.
The death toll from Israel-Gaza fighting keeps climbing as more countries call for a ceasefire.
Not only do the deaths include dozens of Palestinian children, but also
more than 500 homes have been destroyed.
And over 72,000 people have been displaced. Yes, that's 72,000 people without their homes.
Not only that, but an Israeli airstrike damaged Gaza's sole laboratory for processing coronavirus tests.
And Israel is targeting doctors and health facilities to overwhelm its already crumbling system.
Israeli airstrikes have damaged at least 18 hospitals and clinics, according to the World Health Organization.
We could go on and on about the violence and destruction of an attack on the illegal occupation of Palestine, but let's just stop for a moment and ask, who is paying for these crimes against humanity?
We are.
Why does the United States give so much money to Israel?
The United States and Israel have made it official. The two countries signed a new 10-year military assistance deal this month, representing the single largest pledge of its kind in American history.
Aid to Israel is a major part of the weapons industry, and under this new deal, Israel will be required to buy more weapons from the United States and produce less of their own. The pact will be worth $38 billion over the course of a decade, an increase of roughly 27% on the money pledged in the last agreement, which was signed in 2007. And in the words of a retired U.S. Air Force intelligence chief,
it's better than 5 CIAs. What are your taxes paying for in Israel?
Our vast sums of aid to Israel are aggravating conflict rather than building on conditions for peace. We have the power to create obstacles to violence and the obliteration of the Palestinian people by withholding our dollars. All that money could go towards vaccines in India or a myriad of other things.
Like housing?
U.S. military funding to Israel. Minnesota alone gives $68,847,894 a year towards aid to Israel. That could fund
851 elementary schools teachers,
45,752 people receiving food assistance,
11,840 students receiving Pell Grants,
29,041 children receiving health care,
929 clean energy jobs,
And how many homes for the homeless?
It's time to stop the bombing.
Time for us to stop funding the destruction of homes and lives.
Now is the time to use U.S. money and power to support the residents, the citizens of Gaza, and the rest of the occupied Palestine to own and control their own homes.
Evict Israel from occupied Palestine.
And that's the news. Not new news, but the same old news.
Thank you, Marvelous and Esther O. Great stuff indeed. In these times of the pandemic, not a lot of issues are more impactful to individuals and families across this country than evictions. And we at Zamia will continue to keep an eye on that Palestinian-Israeli conflict as well. If you have any thoughts about any of that news, please drop those in our chat box. We'd love to hear from you. Okay, from one blockbuster HNN segment to another. One of my favorite segments of this show is the In Focus segment, starring Mr. Finger on the Pulse of the Community Advocate for Unity, Roberto Blood. For today's episode of In Focus, Roberto brings us the second installment of his 4-part mini-series on the topic of redlining.
Thanks, Corey. Good afternoon and welcome to HNN's In Focus. I'm your host, Robert Roberto Blood. And today I'm going to be bringing you part 2 of my series, Redlining in Minneapolis. The city of Minneapolis was incorporated the same year Minneapolis became a state, in 1858. By the mid-20s, when Minneapolis was booming, redlining was starting to become widespread in the upper middle class and upper class neighborhoods throughout the city. In 1923, the Star Trib wrote this statement about the neighborhoods surrounding Lake Nokomis. Premises shall not be sold, mortgaged, or leased to occupy by any person or persons other than members of the Caucasian race. The National Housing Act of 1934 was to improve housing conditions and make housing more accessible to more people. Redlining was outlawed in 1948, but was made illegal in 1968 by the FHA and again in 1977 by the Community Reinvested Act. The CRA requires the Federal Reserve and other federal banking institutions to help meet credit needs of the low and moderate people living in those neighborhoods. At the start of the century, we became reliant on separation of rich and poor. So I'd like to thank you again and join us next week for part 3 of Redlining in Minneapolis. Remember, stop staring, start seeing. Peace, I'm out.
Thank you so much, Roberto. Love that series. Absolutely love that series. Fantastic information about redlining. Please drop any thoughts you have about redlining in the chat box. And be sure to catch Roberto's 3rd installment of his 4-part In Focus series on redlining during our next HNN episode on June 10th. And what a great note to end the show on. Yes, I know, unfortunately, we have reached the end of this edition of HNN. But before we go, we'd like to thank our entire Zamly members. You, our viewers, are Zamtastic. Directors Esther O and K Flo. Special thanks to Rebecca, aka Bex Noon, Marin, aka Junior, and my girl Ames in Tahiti, holding it down in the chat box. And a heartfelt thanks to David Jordahl for sharing his unique brand of activism with us. We'd also like to warmly thank our sponsors, Jewish Voice for Peace. Now, you can learn more about that wonderful organization by hopping over to their website at jewishvoiceforpeace.org or by clicking on their link on our Facebook page. And as a reminder, for all the ZAM latest, check out our website at zamiatheater.org. And while you're there, sign up for our quarterly newsletter. Our mid-May issue just dropped. And for all the latest, you can also click on the events tab on our Facebook page. And while you're there, don't forget to hit like. In the meantime, we'll see you all on our next episode of Homeless News Network.